Back in October of last year, I made a video that I really enjoyed making, despite it not doing tremendously well. It was an analysis of Saw 2, one of my favourite movies of all time, and in my opinion the definitive Saw movie and one of the best horror sequels in the genre's history. It got a modest but not great view count, but I'm super happy to report that the feedback from the people who did watch it was so good I want to make this into a mini-series on my channel. The first 3 Saw movies were supposed to be a trilogy, and Saw 3 would mark the end of the series. But as we all know, horror movie execs are thirsty as hell for sequels, and Saw would proceed to get a good half a dozen more, with another 1 or 2 currently in the pipeline. But at least in my mind, Saw, Saw 2 and Saw 3 remain a trilogy worthy of the title, and form a mostly complete story that never needed the sequels it received. As such, the Saw 2 analysis will retroactively form the first in my own trilogy, where I'll be working through each of these 3 iconic movies, and discussing what they contributed to the films that followed them, what sets them apart from each other, and how they work together to form a narrative and thematic whole. We've covered Saw 2, the meatiest entry in the franchise, and the one that defined the content and themes of the whole series, but today we're going to go back to basics, and look at the film that started it all, Saw. But before we get started, I'd like to talk to you about a game rather less, stressful than Jigsaw's. Raid Shadow Legends. It's the mobile game that needs no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway because it's my channel and it's a free country. Raid Shadow Legends is a turn-based fantasy game where you lead your favourite champions into battle to reconquer Teleria alone or with your clan. I'm actually a massive fan of the enormous cast of characters that they're constantly building on. With over 600 champions to choose from, there's going to be one that clicks with you from a design and visual perspective, and they're brought to life with high quality models and animations made to a consistently high standard rarely seen in a mobile game, and you're gonna need every single one of them. Because right now Raid's introduced a gnarly new boss, the Hydra, which presents a unique challenge with 6 different heads to mix things up and present a complex new challenge to take on as a clan. Each head has special abilities that change how the boss battle plays out. For example, the Head of Wrath will lash out and do immense damage if you hit it more than 15 times without being able to kill it, but the Head of Decay can protect it with a life barrier that will fully heal it if you don't break the barrier in time, creating an interesting dilemma with how you choose to distribute your attacks. It's never been a better time to get started with Raid, and you can use my link in the description or the QR code on screen to get a free starter pack worth almost $30. It's got a free champion Ina, 200k silver, an XP boost, an energy refill, and 1 ancient shard. But it's only for new players the next 30 days, so time is of the essence. After downloading the game, just tap your inbox to redeem your rewards here, and then you're good to go. Be sure to send me a friend request when you do. My name is, as always, Pixelbush, and good luck. In many ways, Saw was a miracle baby of the early 2000s box office. It was a success that should not have succeeded. At that time, horror cinema was enduring one of its worst fatigue periods in modern history, with the wave of self-aware horror comedies following Scream's release in 1996 having pretty much petered out as fast as it came. Saw was filmed in 18 days on a $1.2 million budget, less than a third of the $4.2 million budget of its sequel, and less than 10% of Scream's $15 million budget. And yet it gave birth to a billion-dollar franchise that's made more in its 18-year lifespan than Halloween has made in over 40 years. How does such a legendary name in horror start from such humble beginnings? Well, the best starting point isn't to look at Scream or any other horror movie, but instead to look at a film considered by many to be the mature, responsible older brother of Saw. The 1995 cop thriller, Seven. Seven follows the story of 2 detectives chasing a trail of bizarrely mutilated victims of an unhinged and ideologically-driven serial killer. Sound familiar? In terms of content, tone and setting, Saw is a lot like Seven, but creators James Wan and Lee Winnell maintained that the big difference between the two was that while Seven focused on the detective solving the crime, Saw was the story of the victims of it. And here I think is the secret ingredient to Saw's incredible success, and the starting point for the string of lucrative sequels. It's how Saw saved itself from being a soulless rip-off of Seven and was able to arrive at the right place at the right time with just the right messaging to spark a billion-dollar franchise that would dominate the Halloween box office for 7 years in a row. Part 1. Exploitation without exploitation. The Saw franchise has been commonly lambasted by critics and moral guardians alike for indulging in what's commonly known as torture porn. a term coined by David Edelstein in 2006 to describe the wave of splatter horror movies that surrounded Saw, like Hostel and The Devil's Rejects. And while I'd say Saw's sequels definitely fit this label, especially those at the tail end of the original series that have almost a circus-like vibe to them, I think calling Saw itself torture porn is incredibly reductive, and a manifestation of the critical snobbery that's fairly common when mainstream critics have to dip their toes into horror movies, especially ones that have met commercial success. In terms of graphic displays of violence and gore, Saw's actually fairly mild. The most disturbingly gory scene is probably Amanda's escape from the reverse bear trap by gouging open the stomach of her cellmate. And don't get me wrong, that scene is pretty messed up, but it's full of cutaways and short, sharp editing, so you don't really get a good eyeful, in the same way that a film like Hostel or even Saw's later sequels tend to, which are characterised either by a lingering attention to detail in the torture scenes, or just buckets of fake blood. Nevertheless, Saw manages to evoke a similar watching through your fingers response as many of those movies, through its combination of harrowing sound design and its constant emphasis on the distress of the victims of the traps. Unlike a more conventional horror flick, where a person is directly attacking or torturing someone, I'm going to use Hostel again as an example here, the setup of traps where the victims have to harm themselves means the agony and the action are indivisible. You can't watch Dr. Gordon's foot getting sawed off without watching him do it, and seeing his face contort with agony and go pale from the loss of blood. A conventional slasher can allow the audience to live vicariously through them. Michael Myers is the classic example of a slasher villain whose victims are mostly just expendable, basically bags of blood and screaming to stab for the audience's catharsis. But Saw forces us to identify with the victims, and therefore empathise with their pain, by taking the slasher out of the slasher movie. By forcing you to engage directly with the victims and share directly in their suffering, Saw represented the mainstream revival of exploitation horror for the 21st century, inheriting the mantle from new French extremity cinema at the turn of the millennium. The uncompromising grimness of Saw bears a lot of similarities to 60s, 70s and 80s horror movies like The Hills Have Eyes, The Last House on the Left, and the incredibly controversial Cannibal Holocaust. All movies that do not shy away from violence and brutality as part of the stories, but at the same time don't glorify it by masking it behind a charismatic and marketable slasher villain. This is something that sequels did, but we're not talking about those right now. It represented a swerve back away from the self-aware horror comedies like Scream that dominated the box office in the late 90s. While Scream lambasted the tropes of a slasher horror from decades past, Saw discarded those tropes, but dressing its horror up as a serious mystery thriller. It was both a step forward as it was able to move on from the tired character slasher subgenre, and a step back to a more serious and vicious portrayal of violence and brutality in horror without getting too, well, exploitative with that brutality. It was the perfect film for the time. The cold, refreshing shower after the uncomfortably hot and stifling self-awareness of Scream and its successors. There's a distinction I'd very much like to make here. Just because Saw represented a revival of exploitation horror doesn't mean the film's content itself is exploitative in the same way that its sequels often were. Exploitation cinema doesn't get its name from the film's content per se, but instead from the creative decisions behind it designed to capitalise on trends, to allow audiences to easily access themes and ideas that can't get anywhere else, or just to rehash tried and tested formulas, like slasher horror, women in prison films, or martial arts movies. That means everything from the endless Halloween sequels to Hallmark Christmas movies fall under the exploitation label. But despite Saw's combination of brutality and cheapness that's characteristic in exploitation horror, it treats its central characters with a lot more respect than most pieces of exploitation cinema. Because the movie is, at its core, a mystery. And you can't have a mystery without seeding clues for the characters and audience to cotton on to answer the questions posed by the film. Why are Adam and Lawrence in this bathroom? Who put them there? And what do they have to do to escape alive? If Saw was satisfied to be just another cheap piece of exploitation horror, banking on violence and gore to sell cinema tickets, these questions would not be as important as they are. The mutilation that Lawrence ends up inflicting on himself isn't the movie's selling point. It's a consequence of his failure. And the movie makes that abundantly clear because despite being set up at the very start of the movie, the saws that represent the way out are all but ignored for the majority of the film's runtime, in favour of solving Jigsaw's conundrums, and only come into play when the characters have either failed or given up the frantic search to solve them. That's another element that reminds me of Seven. The use of violence as a means to cut the Gordian knot the story represents, to take the easy way out when all other options have been closed off to you, and the horrific negative repercussions of giving in. That's what happens when Detective Mills gives up and shoots John Doe at the climax of Seven. He knows it's what Doe wanted, to prove his point and destroy his own life, but he doesn't care because it's the only option that he sees left. Dr. Gordon cutting his foot off comes from the same point of desperation. Despite Jigsaw having left a way for him to escape if he plays along, he takes the easy way out. Both of them have been so worn down by their experiences that the actions that would previously be unthinkable to them have now become the only options they will consider to rid themselves of the nightmare that is their lives right now. It's this gradual decay in the presence of violence not as the central point of the movie, but merely as the consequence of the character's own actions that saves Saw from the label of exploitation, at least in my opinion. That might not have been why general audiences flocked to see it, and why critics panned it, but that's not why it was made, or what the film mostly concerns itself with. Saw shared lots of characteristics with exploitation cinema, and in many ways represented a revival of it, without actually being exploitation cinema in and of itself. And that's what makes Saw both an artifact of its time back in 2004, and a film that has aged surprisingly well. It's a violent mystery thriller, not a slasher movie, something that a lot of viewers who'd come to see it for the gore and violence critics and moral guardians promised them were quite surprised to learn. And part of what I think misled many of those critics was the biggest gulf between Saw and Seven, the role of the police. Part 2. We have a buddy cop movie at home. The three officers we see working the Jigsaw case are Detectives David Tapp, Stephen Singh and Alison Carey. And while Alison would come back as a more central character for the next two movies, she surrenders the spotlight to Singh and especially Tapp in the original. If you watch Seven directly before Saw, the similarities between the cops in both movies can't really be ignored. A partnership between a young detective who gets emotionally invested in the victims of the crimes and ends up suffering at the killer's hands, and an old veteran of the force at the brink of retirement whose departure from the front lines gets ground to a halt when their partner falls from grace under their watch. The parallels are there, but what Saw does with this is take the ending of Seven and move it to about the halfway mark. When Tapp and Singh are first introduced, they could almost be main characters with how much narrative space they take up. Dr. Gordon's flashbacks introduce Tapp, Singh and Jigsaw to us as a pretty separate narrative from the situation in the bathroom. While Gordon ties the two together, the story continues to follow the aftermath of Gordon's interactions with them, as Tapp and Singh start to pick apart the truth behind Amanda's game and eventually track Jigsaw down to the mannequin factory. In any other movie, Detective Tapp would be the main character. The hard-bitten detective tracking down the twisted serial killer in the wretched hive of scum and villainy that is the mid-2000s American cityscape. That idea was so common at the time that it was almost a 90s cliché, established by action films like Die Hard and Lethal Weapon, that bled over into thrillers like 8mm and, yes, Seven. Danny Glover has almost as much screen time as Lee Winnell and Kari Elwes. I haven't actually gone through and counted, but he might even have more screen time than Winnell. And yet his role in the story is largely tangential. He provides context to the Jigsaw murders and ties Adam and Lawrence together, without his arc really coming to anything on its own. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not knocking that as a creative decision at all. It helps to keep the focus on the desperation of the victims. It'd be a hell of a lot harder to believe Lawrence and Adam might actually die if the movie was stalling for time until Detective Tapp broke the door down and saved the day. That's not his job in this story, much as he might want it to be. The only time he so much as scratches the main plot with Adam and Lawrence is when Zepp calls the bathroom to let them know they failed their game, and that Alison and Diana Gordon are going to die. Tapp's intervention saves them and forces Zepp to flee, but the sound of the scuffle over the phone drives Lawrence to cut the Gordian knot and saw off his own foot in desperation, after which Tapp soon dies at Zepp's hands. If you were to write Tapp out of the story completely, nothing about the main centrepiece of the movie, the bathroom game, would change at all. Dr. Gordon would still cut off his foot in an attempt to escape, Zepp would still arrive at the bathroom, Adam would still kill him. The only differences would be that Alison and Diana Gordon would be dead, and we as an audience wouldn't know anything about Jigsaw or the connection between Lawrence and Adam. The plotline itself wouldn't really change. but the relationship between Lawrence and Adam would be dramatically cheapened because it'd just be two random dudes. The plot would function, but the story would suffer. Tap doesn't hold up the story like Lawrence or Adam, but instead strengthens it like a support beam, and that's okay. By setting up Tap and Sing as big players in the hunt for the truth, Saw begins to resemble the detective story that inspired it. But Sing's death and Tap's fall from grace bring the emphasis back to the real duo that matters, Lawrence and Adam. For their part, the two bathroom boys are just great. The chemistry between Jigsaw's victims can literally be the thing that makes or breaks a Saw movie, and the original is, of course, no exception. The relationship evolving throughout the movie is what keeps you watching it in the face of its unrelenting bleakness. That bleakness has a profound effect on both of them across the rest of the story. Dr. Gordon starts off as the calm, responsible and proactive leader of the two, but degenerates very quickly into a blubbering, barely coherent emotional wreck as the pressures on both his life and those of his wife and daughter forces him to hurt both himself and Adam. Regardless of the quality of a film overall, I will always give props to an actor who gives a role their all. And Kari Elwes managed to capture almost every part of Lawrence Gordon pretty damn well. From the smug, self-important office dweller to the proactive, intelligent leader, to the volatile sneerer who won't take responsibility for his actions, to the broken, livid wretch barely clinging on to life and kept moving by sheer force of will. It wouldn't have worked without a dedicated and some would argue over-the-top performance from Elwes. The only part I think he did struggle with was the scenes with Mackenzie Vega, who played the young Diana Gordon. Despite his best attempts, it felt like Diana was in more danger around him than she was around Zepp. However, I know I'm not alone in saying Adam is the highlight of most of this movie. And yes, that's not an unpopular opinion among Saw fans, but I can't say I blame them. Unlike Gordon, it's less of a strong performance that makes Adam stand out, and more the fact that every single word that comes out of Leigh Whannell's mouth is pure gold. Leigh Whannell is not a career actor, but Adam's lines are so good that you could give them to a wooden plank and they still make me crack up.
What do you care what I think anyway? I don't give a crap if you covered yourself in peanut butter and had a 15-hooker gangbang.
In many ways, Whannell didn't even really need to act beyond exasperated or horrified, and he pulled off both of them well enough to make Adam Sandheit's personality shine through. The actors are both well suited to their characters. If Whannell played Lawrence and Elwes played Adam, the movie would be incredibly jarring, and Dr. Gordon especially wouldn't ring true. But given the film's low budget and tight production schedule, it's really impressive what they managed to pull together with these two. They're the Mills and Somerset of Saw, that Tap and Sing never got allowed to be. The buddy cops, if you will. Except their relationship is strained by their alienation from each other, and the creeping reality that eventually one of them will likely have to kill the other. That's where the horror of Saw resides. It's not in the trap necessarily, but in the realisation that the person sitting next to you might be entirely willing to kill you to see another day, and the only thing that will save you from that fate is beating them to it. Without ever diving into the details of Jigsaw's philosophy like the sequels do, Saw begins to draw the outlines of Jigsaw's philosophy that would form the backbone of those sequels and define not just the character, but the whole franchise. Which leads me to my final section, the big man himself. Let's talk Jigsaw. Part 3. The role of Jigsaw. Much like Tap, Jigsaw is a character who receives surprisingly little attention, especially given, he's the reason every event in the movie takes place. For the overwhelming majority of the movie, Jigsaw's presence is indicated only by the audio and videotapes that he leaves to address his victims, and that's how Tap tracks him to the mannequin factory. Outside of what the victims see from him, we're never actually introduced to Jigsaw until halfway through the runtime of the film, when Tap and Sing track him down to the mannequin factory. And that's the closest thing we ever get to a motive exposition from him. There's one particular line in this motive rant that caught me off guard. I'm sick of it all. Is it just me who thinks this doesn't sound quite right? At least when compared to how John predicted in the sequels. The John we see here isn't the wizened old philosopher casually eating in his chair in the beginning of Saw 2. He's outwardly angry. There's a reason that John's only act of outright violence happens in Saw. The Jigsaw of this movie is more bloody-minded and vicious than the later installments. Compare how he deals with Eric and the police in Saw 2 versus how he deals with Tappan Singh in Saw. It seems almost crude. Hell, in this movie, the claim that he isn't technically a murderer isn't even made by him. It's made by Dr. Gordon.
Actually, technically speaking, he's not really a murderer.
And by virtue of being a character mostly obscured by the story, Tobin Bell doesn't really have a lot to do in this film. He spends most of it vibing on the floor or vibing in a bed, meaning the brief window we do see of him in the flesh acting as Jigsaw makes much more of an impact. Retroactively, John's portrayal here doesn't really make sense of what we know him to be in the sequels. But the sequels didn't exist yet, so technically they're the ones that don't make sense. The character Saw paints is much more openly sadistic and willing to kill to achieve his goals. That lack of scruples or philosophy even extends to the traps. He leaves the key to Amanda's reverse bear trap in the stomach of her cellmate to force her to kill him, but gives the man himself no means to prevent this. Effectively, John has condemned him to die by Amanda's hand. He never got to make his choice. He never had a chance to fight for his life like the other victims because he's merely a tool to be used in Amanda's game, not a person worthy of his own. The same story goes for Alyssa and Diana Gordon. Their sole role is to be pawns in John's game with Lawrence. They haven't done anything wrong, they don't deserve Zep to kill them, but they're part of John's game, so that doesn't matter. And when you watch Saw, that won't be an issue for you. Even if, like me, you think John becomes a much more compelling character in the sequels, there's no denying the role he plays in Saw works well for the movie that he's in. As I've been saying since the dawn of time, it's a movie about Lawrence and Adam, not about Jigsaw. And his philosophies taking a back seat in favour of exploring his impact on his victims helps maintain the focus of the film within the confines of the bathroom. In a way, Jigsaw doesn't really exist in this film, not yet anyway. He's not a fully developed character with the principles, motivations and detailed backstory that Saw 2 would give him, because in Saw it's not his job to be. I truly think the only reason he appears in person at all is to give Adam's ending in the bathroom some sense of closure, because the identity doesn't really matter to us right now. Beyond the, ooh, he's the guy in the bed from earlier recognition, what does the reveal that John Kramer is Jigsaw actually tell us? We now know who Jigsaw is, but we don't know why that matters because we don't know who John Kramer is. In that regard, Saw was gearing us up for a sequel before it even got going, even if 1 and 1L didn't know it yet. And I felt really smart writing this section until I watched Ryan Hollinger's video on Saw and realised he said exactly the same thing. Jigsaw in this movie isn't the John Kramer of Saw 2 and beyond, and that's okay. He's the big bad wolf of the brutal modern fairy tale that Saw is. Think of it like a morality play, like Grimm's fairy stories or Dante's Inferno, the languishing of sinners in a purgatory of their own making. The wicked are punished by the monster, the devil, the big bad wolf. And when was the last time anyone asked why the big bad wolf wanted to blow the little pig's houses down? What matters is that he does. He's not going to be swayed by arguments of reason to stop it, and now the people we actually care about have to deal with that problem. That's what Jigsaw is. He's part of the problem that Lawrence and Adam have to solve, and the reveal that the body on the floor was the mastermind the whole time is part of the punishment for their failure, especially Adam. It's why so many of the movie's plot holes, contrivances and suspension of disbelief are so often forgiven with this movie. Of course there's chains that obviously aren't electrified can still shock Adam. Of course there's 2 cigarettes in the box so Lawrence can make the switch. Of course the key to Adam's shackles was in the bathtub the whole time but went down the plug hole. The more you think about it, the less real world sense it makes. But they're necessary to make the point the story is trying to make, and so we live with it because that's how the story goes. The point I'm trying to make here isn't that Saw is some forgotten and unfairly maligned masterpiece of the genre, because that title belongs unambiguously to Saw 2, and I will fight anybody who disagrees with me on that one. Saw's greatest success is in its simplicity. It's 2 men in a bathroom figuring out how to survive, and the story coalescing around their relationship. Sure, the sequels engage with heavier concepts like the practicalities of being Jigsaw, the precise motivations and philosophy of John Kramer, and the effects the games have on the survivors after they've passed, but Saw doesn't bother with that, and nor should it have done. They say hell is being locked in a room with your best friend forever, and Saw locks two men in hell and hides the key behind a veil of suffering. It's a surprisingly timeless movie that, despite the fact it will not let you forget 2004, finds itself capable of standing the test of time far better than most movies in its series. It's no surprise that the movie didn't get on well with critics who couldn't grok the suspension of disbelief required to make viewing Saw a tolerable experience. But it's also no surprise that such a brutal morality play, centred around the suffering of its victims, appealed so well to horror audiences. All that the sadistic mastermind at centre of it would become one of the most iconic killers in cinema history. Side note, this is also why I do not trust mainstream critics who don't review horror movies typically to review a horror movie. Seriously though, I'm really tired of mainstream critics reviewing horror movies in complete bad faith. If you don't like horror movies, don't try and review one for God's sakes. And if you're looking for a review of a horror movie, look for a place where actual horror movie fans reside. Bly Disgusting, Fangoria, Dead Meat, Ryan Hollinger, these places exist and you can find them. They're way better resources than some dusty-old critic who says his favourite movie is some obscure Romanian docudrama that he only half watched because he's too busy trying to fast forward to the lesbian sex scene halfway through. But I'm going off topic. So, if you haven't watched Saw, forget the moral guardians who hyped it up as the most violent movie ever made when it came out because they didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. And don't let the label of torture porn that it thoroughly didn't deserve put you off. For all its miserable brutality, there's a charm to it that the sequels rapidly start to lose after the second or third film. And if there's one thing Jigsaw would want you to do, it's to value the little things. The quirks and charms of your modern humdrum life. Because you won't truly appreciate what's right there in front of you until you realise it's game over. Okay, that's everything I have to say about Saw. You might notice I talked about Amanda Young very little or not at all this video, but in light of the fact that she has a much bigger role in Saw 3, which will be the topic of my next Saw video, and is likely to have a very big role in the upcoming Saw tome, I thought it was a good idea for me to save my thoughts on Amanda until that happens. In terms of my next video, I've got a couple of things I want to do. I want to make a short little almost videoette talking about the PTB changes for the twins and how behaviour got their heads lodged so far up their asses they could give themselves a colonoscopy. And I also want to talk about VHS, because I got the key for that last week and I have some thoughts on it. To ensure you catch them, I'd recommend that you subscribe to the channel. Maybe leave a comment on this video if you enjoyed it. In the description you can find links to my Twitter, my Twitch, my Discord server, and my Patreon and Ko-fi links if this content is worth your money. And last but not least, don't forget my Raid Shadow Legends link because they made this video possible. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Ta-ta for now.